The first one is the market really encourages only the survival of the fittest. I'm sure no one's ever heard this, right? The survival of the fittest argument. Well, is that true? Is that really true? I think that's more true of pre-capitalist economies, economies that did not have functioning markets in them, economies that came before the Industrial Revolution. And as F.A. Hayek pointed out in his great introduction to a wonderful collection of essays in the 1950s, I think 1954, called Capitalism and the Historians, when you look at these pre-Industrial Revolution economies, people could not integrate themselves into these economies unless they either could succeed in agriculture or happened by some fortunate happenstance to possess the tools necessary to go into a craft of some kind. Otherwise, there was no way. You couldn't go and sell your labor services to some factory owner. There weren't any. And so really, people say, oh, who would ever want to work in a factory? Well, the question is, who would want to die? Because that was your other option. It's not like people said, I think I'd like to work 16-hour days in miserable conditions. That seems like the best option I have. Well, that's because the other options were much worse. And this is why the economist David Henderson says, whenever you want to help the poor, don't look at the list of their choices and cross off the one they actually chose. If they actually chose the factory system, it could be there was a reason for this. And it turns out that, in fact, because their population was growing dramatically in Britain, there was a huge surplus population for which there was no existing outlet whatsoever in the economy as it existed. So the market, with its employment opportunities, was at least able to absorb these people, and even though obviously nobody would want to be a factory worker in 19th century England today, the fact is that in terms of housing space per capita, caloric intake, they compared favorably to the agricultural workers of their day. And in fact, in all these other metrics that we look at, it turns out that indeed living standards were improving, even during this time of tremendous population growth, and even during a time when Britain was on and off engaged in war, in the wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. So the standard of living would have been even higher in the absence of that. So now there's obviously a great deal more that one could say about the Industrial Revolution, but the point is that before we had the kind of sophisticated markets that we have today, there wasn't anything for a lot of these people to do that would have allowed them to earn an income at all. Moreover, the production processes in the economy were so primitive that we could produce only a tiny, tiny fraction of the consumer goods we can produce today. And so that means that each person, on average, had to content himself with a much tinier fraction of goods than we take for granted in our great abundance today. But when, under the free market, businesses are free to take their profits and reinvest them in their businesses and purchase capital equipment that makes the production process much more physically productive, that means we have a much greater abundance of goods. So we have a greater abundance of goods per capita. It becomes cheaper in terms of prices vis-a-vis wages for people to acquire the necessities of life than otherwise, and this is how our living standards increase, because we become physically capable of greater and greater abundance. I always use the example of my father, who was a forklift operator in a food warehouse for 15 years. Now, with that forklift, he could do the work of 20 people. And in fact, he could do work that no person could have done, because nobody can stack a pallet 20 feet high, no matter how many of you've got, unless you're going to stand on each other's heads in a sort of circus acrobat routine. You need a forklift for that sort of work. And that doesn't mean that my father having the forklift, now suddenly 19 people are just twiddling their thumbs. There are always other things we need done in the economy. But we couldn't have had those things because 19 people are wasting their time taking pallets and walking 100 yards with them and putting them somewhere and then walking all the way back. That's obviously not the best use of their services. Now that they're released to produce other goods, everybody is better off. There's a greater abundance of goods. The greater abundance through competition leads the prices of those goods to go down vis-a-vis wages, and we see our real incomes increase. And this is true in all lines of production. If you think of books being produced today as compared to with a 16th century printing press, or even now that we have electronic books, think of how cheaply they can be produced now. Okay, so now we can now go and produce other things. And if you think, but there's a limit. Right? There's a limit of things people want to buy. So if you release these people they're just going to sit around unemployed. Well, if the government makes it hard for people to be hired, that can be true for a time. But think not just about all the additional goods that could be produced, or ways that goods could be produced more cheaply now that labor is more abundant, but just think about any one of us. Any one of us would love to have the personal services of 3 or 4 people. I mean, any one of us would love to have a gardener, a chef, and a chauffeur. Right? I mean, any one of us could put at least 3 or 4 people to work if labor were abundant enough for that to be possible. But it's not. The way we know it isn't is that nobody in this room can afford to do it, which means they're being pulled away by something more urgent elsewhere in the economy. We'll always find some place in a free market, genuine free market, we'll always find some place to put them. But the point is that what is this process doing for the most vulnerable people in society? It's dramatically increasing their standard of living. And in fact, in the United States, throughout the 20th century, the purchasing power of the poorest increased by about 1,900%, which was much higher than we saw for any other income quintile. In fact, if we look at the poverty statistics during the 20th century, we see that at the beginning of the 20th century, we would say, by today's standards, that 95% of Americans were living in what we would today call poverty. By the late 1960s, that figure was down to between 12 and 14%. And that was with really almost no anti-poverty programs worth speaking of. I mean, very, very little. The Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson really got going in terms of funding only in the late 60s. And then the poverty rate more or less stagnated. So you get, like say 1994, they're spending quadruple per capita what they'd been spending in the late 60s, and poverty rate had stagnated. Now, suppose the situation had been reversed. Let's suppose we began with 95% poverty, and that all through the 20th century, up through the late 60s, we had very well-funded anti-poverty programs, trillions of dollars poured in. And let's say that we saw the poverty rate fall to 12 to 14%. Let's say further that at that point, we just decided we hate the poor, and we're greedy, and we want to stop giving them all this money, and we just cut off all those programs, and then the poverty level stagnated. I think we know what the story that we would hear would be. You see, government programs are what eradicate poverty. Look at the great success we had, all from the 1900s, early, all the way down to the late 1960s. And then we got rid of the anti-poverty programs and poverty stagnated. Man, you stupid Neanderthals, isn't that all you need to know, that we need more government funding? But you notice that that's not what happened. That's the exact opposite of what happened. So what do we hear about this? Nothing. No acknowledgement of this. Nothing in a textbook the kids are reading about in school. Nothing. No mention of it at all. So this is, I think, one of the explanations for my Twitter critic having this view. I understand. I don't think she's an idiot having this view. This is only what she's been taught every single day her whole life. What else would she think? But in terms of this survival of the fittest question, it's that the market allows the survival of people who would surely have perished in a pre-market society. There simply wouldn't have been the resources to keep them alive. And so Murray Rothbard wrote in Man, Economy, and State, he says, the free market is precisely the diametric opposite of the jungle society. The jungle is characterized by the war of all against all. One man gains only at the expense of another by seizure of the latter's property. With all on a subsistence level, there is a true struggle for survival, with the stronger force crushing the weaker. In the free market, on the other hand, one man gains only through serving another. It is precisely through the peaceful cooperation of the market that all men gain through the development of the division of labor and capital investment. To apply the principle of the survival of the fittest to both the jungle and the market is to ignore the basic question, fitness for what? The fit in the jungle are those most adept at the exercise of brute force. The fit on the market are those most adept in the service of society. The jungle is a brutish place where some seize from others and all live at the starvation level. The market is a peaceful and productive place where all serve themselves and others at the same time and live at infinitely higher levels of consumption. And he goes on, the free market, therefore, transmutes the jungle's destructive competition for meager subsistence into a peaceful cooperative competition in the service of oneself and others. In the jungle, some gain only at the expense of others. On the market, everyone gains. It is the market, the contractual society, that wrests order out of chaos, that subdues nature and eradicates the jungle, that permits the weak to live productively in a regal style compared to the life of the strong in the jungle. Furthermore, the market, by raising living standards, permits man the leisure to cultivate the very qualities of civilization that distinguish him from the brutes.